The abandoned water tower stood like a concrete gravestone against the Nevada desert sky. Jake Reaper Morrison cut his Harley's engine at the base, drawn by something he couldn't name. 20 years riding with the Hell Angeles, he'd seen every kind of darkness, but nothing prepared him for what waited inside. Rusted metal stairs groaned under his boots as he climbed. At the top, in a shaft of dusty sunlight, stood a small grey donkey wearing a handmade sign, "Useless." The animal's eyes weren't ordinary. They glowed with an ancient intelligence that made Jake's blood run cold. What Jake didn't know was that his grandmother's Cherokee bloodline had marked him as a guardian, chosen to protect creatures caught between worlds. The donkey wasn't useless. It was the last keeper of forgotten magic, hidden here by forces that would kill to possess its power. When Jake touched the animal's muzzle, visions flooded his mind. His missing sister, a dark cult, and a prophecy that would either save two worlds or destroy them both. But why had the donkey been waiting specifically for him? The moment Jake's calloused fingertips made contact with the donkey's soft nose, the world exploded into fragments of light and shadow. He staggered backward, his leather jacket scraping against the concrete wall as images cascaded through his consciousness like a broken dam. Sarah. His sister's face materialized first, her auburn hair whipping in an unnatural wind as robed figures surrounded her. She was screaming his name, her voice echoing across what looked like a vast cavern carved from obsidian. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Sarah had vanished 3 months ago, leaving only her abandoned car on a lonely stretch of Highway 95. The cops had given up after 6 weeks. The vision shifted, and he saw the cultists more clearly. Their faces were gaunt, eyes rolled back to show only whites, and strange symbols glowed beneath their pale skin like infected tattoos. They chanted in a language that made his bones ache, their voices weaving together into something that felt older than mountains. Then came the prophecy, spoken in his grandmother's voice, though she'd been dead 15 years. When the marked beast meets the guardian's touch, the veil shall thin. 2 worlds hang in balance, one of flesh, one of spirit. The useless shall become mighty, and the broken shall make whole. Jake jerked his hand away, gasping. The donkey watched him with those impossible eyes, patient as stone. Around its neck hung a leather cord he hadn't noticed before, threaded with turquoise beads that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "What the hell are you?" Jake whispered, his voice hoarse. The donkey stepped closer, and Jake felt warmth spread through his chest. Not the burn of whiskey or the heat of desert sun, but something deeper. It reminded him of sitting by his grandmother's fire as a child, listening to stories about the spirit world that existed alongside their own. Stories he'd dismissed as folklore after his parents' deaths had hardened him into the man he'd become. His phone buzzed. A text from Rico, his club president. "Where you at, brother? Got heat looking for you." Jake glanced at the message, then back at the donkey. The animal had moved to the edge of the platform and was staring out across the desert. Following its gaze, Jake saw a dust cloud rising in the distance, vehicles approaching fast. His gut tightened. The same instinct that had kept him alive through bar fights and territory wars screamed that whatever was coming wasn't the usual kind of trouble. The donkey made a sound, not quite a bray, more like wind chimes caught in a storm. The turquoise beads around its neck flared brighter, and Jake felt something shift in the air around them. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, and shadows began moving in ways that defied the sun's position. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" Jake asked, though he didn't expect an answer. The donkey turned back to him, and Jake swore he saw ancient sadness in those glowing eyes. It stepped forward and gently head-butted his chest, right over his heart. The warmth spread again, and with it came understanding, not in words but in feeling. This creature had been waiting for him specifically, waiting for someone with enough darkness in his past to recognize the light when he found it. The dust cloud was closer now. Jake could make out 3 black SUVs racing across the hardpan, their windows tinted dark as midnight. His Harley sat exposed at the base of the tower like a neon sign announcing his presence. He looked at the donkey again, at the crude sign hanging from its neck. Someone had wanted this creature found, but marked in a way that most people would ignore, who left powerful magical beings in abandoned places with signs calling them worthless. The answer came with a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold now permeating the air. Someone who wanted them found by exactly the right kind of person. Someone broken enough to see past the label. Someone desperate enough to believe in impossible things. Someone like him. The donkey's words hit Jake like a sledgehammer to the chest. He stumbled backward, his leather jacket catching on a rusted piece of metal jutting from the wall. The rational part of his mind screamed that he was hallucinating, that the crash had scrambled his brains worse than he thought. But the donkey's amber eyes held an ancient intelligence that made his skin crawl. "What the hell are you?" Jake's voice cracked like a teenager's. The donkey shifted, chains clanking against stone. Up close, Jake could see the shackles weren't just old. They were inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light from his phone. "I am Balthazar, last keeper of the threshold gate, and you, leather-clad wanderer, are either my salvation or the herald of this world's final darkness." Jake barked out a laugh that echoed off the walls. "Yeah, right. I'm nobody's salvation, pal. I can't even keep a job at a gas station without screwing it up." He turned toward the stairs, his boots crunching on debris. "I'm getting out of here before whatever's in the air makes me crazier. Jake Morrison." He froze. The donkey hadn't raised his voice, but somehow Jake's name hung in the air like a physical weight. Born October 13th, 32 years ago. Fired from 17 jobs. Evicted from your apartment last month. Your motorcycle, a 1987 Harley Sportster, is the only thing you own that matters to you. Balthazar's voice carried a sad knowing that made Jake's fists clench. "Your sister Sarah calls you every Tuesday, though you rarely answer. She has cancer." The words slammed into Jake's gut. He spun around, rage flooding his system. "How do you know about Sarah?" "Because the magic that brought you here sees everything, Jake Morrison. It sees the pain you carry, the way you push everyone away because you're convinced you're poison. It sees how you blame yourself for not being there when your parents died." Balthazar's chains clinked as he took a step forward. "Most importantly, it sees what you cannot, that your greatest weakness is actually your greatest strength. My greatest weakness is that I destroy everything I touch." Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm a walking disaster." "No." The donkey's amber eyes blazed. "Your greatest weakness is that you care too much. You feel everything so deeply that you've convinced yourself you're better off alone. But the magic doesn't make mistakes, Jake. It brought you here because this world needs someone who understands what it means to be considered worthless." The air around them began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Jake blinked, and suddenly the crumbling tower looked different. The stones weren't just old, they were covered in the same writhing symbols as Balthazar's chains. The symbols pulsed with a soft blue light that made his teeth ache. "This realm exists between worlds," Balthazar continued, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "It's a sanctuary for the lost, the broken, the forgotten. For centuries it's been protected by the threshold gate, a barrier that keeps the devourers from finding us." Devourers? Creatures of pure hunger. They consume magic, hope, love, anything that makes existence worthwhile. They've already destroyed 12 realms, Jake. This is one of the last refuges. The donkey's voice cracked with emotion. "But the gate is failing. The magic that sustains it requires a guardian, and He rattled his chains. "I've been bound here for 300 years, my power slowly draining away. Soon there won't be enough left to maintain the barrier." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why are you telling me this? I'm not a hero. I'm not even a decent person." "The Guardian's magic doesn't come from being heroic or decent," Balthazar said quietly. "It comes from understanding powerlessness, from knowing what it means to be overlooked, dismissed, labeled as worthless. The previous Guardian was a street orphan from your world who'd been told her entire life that she'd never amount to anything. Before her, it was a failed merchant who'd lost everything he'd ever built. The shimmer in the air intensified, and Jake caught glimpses of impossible things, floating islands connected by bridges of light, forests where the trees sang in harmony, cities built inside massive crystals. But he also saw darkness creeping at the edges, a hungry void that seemed to devour the very air. "The magic chose you because you've lived your entire life believing you're useless," Balthazar said. "But what if that feeling, that intimate knowledge of being cast aside, is exactly what this world needs to survive?" Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Hey, little brother. Chemo starts Monday. Love you." His hands shook as he read the words. Sarah, who'd never given up on him. Sarah, who saw something worth loving even when he couldn't see it himself. "If I help you," Jake said slowly, "could this magic save her?" Balthazar's eyes filled with something that might have been hope. "The Guardian protects what matters most. But first, you have to choose to believe that you matter too." The donkey's words hit Jake like a sledgehammer to the chest. He stumbled backward, his boots scraping against the stone floor as reality tilted sideways. Animals didn't talk, period. Yet here stood this grey creature, its dark eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. "This isn't happening," Jake muttered, pressing the heels of his palms against his temples. "I'm having some kind of breakdown. Too many years of whiskey and road dust." The donkey tilted its head, ears twitching forward. "You wouldn't be the first to think so. The transition between worlds can be jarring for those unprepared." Its voice carried a strange accent, melodic yet ancient, like wind through forgotten valleys. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his back pocket where he kept his flask, but found only empty denim. He'd left it on his bike. Transition between what now? "You've crossed the threshold," the donkey explained, taking a careful step closer. Jake noticed it moved with an odd grace, despite its humble appearance. "The moment you entered this tower, you left your world behind and stepped into mine, the realm of the unwanted." The name sent a chill down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. "Unwanted. All who find their way here share something in common," the donkey continued, its gaze never wavering. "We've been discarded, deemed worthless by those who should have valued us most. Tell me, Jake Morrison, when did you first hear those words? When did someone you trusted call you useless?" The question landed like a physical blow. Jake's jaw clenched as memories he'd spent decades burying clawed their way to the surface. His father's voice, slurred with alcohol and disappointment. "You're nothing but trouble, boy, worthless as your mother was." "How do you know my name?" Jake demanded, deflecting from the pain that threatened to crack his carefully constructed armor. The donkey's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "The tower remembers all who enter. Your pain calls to it, just as mine once did." It paused, studying Jake's face. "I am Aurelius, though I haven't spoken my true name aloud in decades." "Aurelius." Jake tested the name, finding it strange on his tongue. "What are you exactly?" "What I am now or what I was before?" Aurelius asked with bitter humor. "Once, I was a scholar in the court of King Aldrich. I served faithfully for 20 years, advising on matters of magic and law. But when the kingdom faced invasion, my counsel was deemed insufficient. Useless, the king called me, just before he transformed me into this shape and banished me here." Jake stared at the creature before him, trying to reconcile the image of a learned advisor with the humble donkey. "How long ago?" "Time moves differently here. By your world's measure, perhaps 300 years. The weight of that revelation settled over Jake like a shroud. 3 centuries of isolation, of carrying the sting of rejection and transformation. Yet somehow Aurelius had survived it all. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked quietly. "Because you have a choice to make," Aurelius replied, moving to the center of the circular room. "You can flee back to your world, return to your motorcycle and your empty bottles, carrying your wounds until they consume you entirely, or you can stay and learn what I've discovered in my long years here." "Which is?" Aurelius raised his head, and for a moment Jake caught a glimpse of something magnificent in those dark eyes, a spark of power that made the air itself seem to shimmer. That sometimes being called useless is not a curse. It's preparation. Jake felt his skepticism warring with desperate curiosity. Preparation for what? For the moment when everything others value fails them, and they discover that the broken, the discarded, the ones they labeled worthless were actually their salvation. Aurelius began to pace slowly around the room's perimeter. Dark forces gather in both our worlds, Jake. The barriers between realms grow thin, and chaos seeps through like poison. Traditional heroes with their shining armor and noble hearts will not be enough this time. So you're saying the universe needs a washed-up biker and a talking donkey? I'm saying the universe needs souls forged in rejection and tempered by pain. We know what it means to lose everything. That knowledge makes us dangerous to those who would destroy everything we've ever loved. Jake thought of the photograph in his wallet. His sister Sarah, her kids, the only family he had left, the only people who still believed he might be worth something. What exactly are you asking me to do? Aurelius stopped pacing and fixed him with an intense stare. I'm asking you to embrace what you've always been told you are. Embrace being unwanted, useless, forgotten. And then I'm asking you to help me use that power to save both our worlds. The tower seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Jake's answer. The donkey's eyes held depths Jake had never seen in any animal, swirls of amber and gold that seemed to hold ancient secrets. When it spoke again, its voice carried the weight of centuries. You called me useless, the creature said, tilting its head. Do you know how long it's been since someone spoke truth instead of flattery? Jake's leather jacket felt suddenly heavy on his shoulders. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and rain began pattering against the tower's cracked stones. Look, I don't know what kind of fever dream this is, but talking donkeys aren't exactly my thing. Nor mine, originally. The donkey stepped closer, its hooves clicking against the ancient floor. I was Marcus Aldwyn, court mage to King Theron the Bold, rather impressed with myself, truth be told, until the day I encountered magic beyond my understanding and paid the price for my arrogance. Something in the creature's tone made Jake's skepticism waver. He'd heard that kind of bitter regret before, in his own voice late at night when the bottle was empty and the memories came flooding back. So you're saying you're actually human? Was human. The distinction matters less now. Marcus moved to the window, gazing out at the storm. This tower was once the heart of a great kingdom. Below us stretched the Golden Valley, where children played in meadows that sparkled with natural magic. Now look. Jake joined him at the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. Below, a wasteland spread in all directions, twisted trees, blackened earth, and a sky that seemed perpetually choked with ash. It was as if someone had taken a photograph and burned away all the color. What happened? The Shadow Court happened, beings of pure malice who feed on despair and destruction. They've been spreading across the realms for 300 years, turning everything they touch into this. Marcus's ears drooped. I was supposed to stop them. Instead, I became their greatest failure. Jake studied the devastation below, recognizing something in the hopelessness of it all. It reminded him of the night he'd lost everything, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the silence that followed. Why are you telling me this? Because you're here. Because you called me useless without flinching. Because, Marcus turned those ancient eyes toward him, you understand what it means to carry the weight of your failures. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stepped back, his hand instinctively going to the flask in his jacket pocket. You don't know anything about me, don't I? You ride these back roads to avoid the world. You drink to forget something that happened 3 years ago. You tell yourself you're worthless because it's easier than admitting you're terrified of caring about anything again. Jake's vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't in an impossible tower with a talking donkey. He was back in that hospital corridor, listening to the doctor explain why Emma would never wake up, why their unborn child would never take its first breath, why everything he'd touched had turned to ash in his hands. "Shut up!" The words came out raw, desperate. "I'm not your enemy, Jake Morrison." Marcus's voice gentled. "I'm someone who understands that sometimes the most broken among us are the only ones who can see clearly enough to fight back." Lightning illuminated the wasteland below, and Jake saw something that made his blood freeze. Shapes were moving across the blackened landscape, tall, skeletal figures cloaked in darkness, heading straight for the tower. Their very presence seemed to drain what little life remained from the dead earth. "They've found us," Marcus whispered. "The Shadow Court. They must have sensed the awakening." "Awakening? What awakening?" "The moment you entered this tower, you triggered something that's been dormant for centuries. Old magic, wild magic. The kind that chooses its own champions regardless of whether they feel worthy." Marcus's form began to shimmer, and suddenly Jake could see through him to the approaching army below. "They're coming to ensure it dies before it can grow strong enough to threaten them." Jake backed toward the stairs, his practical mind screaming at him to run. But something held him frozen, not fear exactly, but a strange sense of recognition. He'd spent 3 years running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of failing someone again. Now he stood in an impossible place, being told that his presence had somehow awakened hope in a dying world. "I can't be anyone's champion," he said, hating how his voice shook. "I destroy everything I touch." "Good," Marcus replied, his spectral form solidifying slightly. "Champions are overrated. Heroes charge in believing they're destined to win. But someone who knows intimately what loss feels like, who understands the true cost of failure, that person fights differently, harder, because they know exactly what they're trying to prevent." The shadow figures below began scaling the tower's walls, moving with inhuman speed. Jake felt the flask in his pocket, the familiar weight of his chosen escape. For 3 years, it had been enough to numb the pain. Now, as darkness climbed toward them, and an ancient donkey looked at him with eyes full of desperate hope, Jake Morrison faced a choice that would determine the fate of more than just his own broken heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the crumbling courtyard as Jake emerged from the tower, his leather jacket replaced by a simple tunic that felt foreign against his skin. The donkey, Ezra, trotted beside him with surprising dignity, no longer the pitiful creature he'd first encountered. There was something different about the animal now, an intelligence in those dark eyes that made Jake increasingly uncomfortable. "So what exactly are you?" Jake asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since dawn. Ezra's response came not as words, but as images that flooded Jake's mind. A grand castle where this ruin now stood. A young man with kind eyes and gentle hands, transformed by a curse he'd accepted willingly to save his people. Centuries of waiting, watching his kingdom crumble while he remained trapped in a form that rendered him powerless to help. Jake stumbled, pressing his palms against his temples. "Jesus, warn a guy before you do that." The donkey's ears flicked apologetically, and this time his voice came as a whisper in Jake's thoughts. "Forgive me. I forget how overwhelming the mind speech can be for those unused to magic." "Yeah, well, add it to the list of things I'm apparently useless at." Jake kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the broken flagstones. "Useless." Ezra stopped walking, his head tilting thoughtfully. "You use that word often." "'Cause it fits." Jake's jaw tightened. "Ask anyone who's ever known me. My old man, my crew, the cops, my ex-wife. Hell, ask yourself, what good am I doing here? I can't even figure out how I got to this place, let alone how to help fix whatever's wrong with it." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his mental voice carried a weight that made Jake look down at him sharply. "The curse that binds me requires a specific key to break. Not strength, not wisdom, not noble birth. The magic seeks one who has been deemed worthless by the world, yet possesses the courage to act despite that judgment." Something cold settled in Jake's stomach. "You're saying I'm here because I'm a screw-up?" "I'm saying you're here because the magic recognizes something in you that others have failed to see." Ezra began walking again, his hooves clicking against the stone. Tell me about your motorcycle club, Jake snorted. What's to tell? Bunch of guys who couldn't cut it anywhere else, riding around pretending we matter, yet you led them. I was president, yeah. Fat lot of good it did them. The familiar weight of guilt pressed down on Jake's shoulders. Tommy's in prison because of a job I planned. Mick's drinking himself to death because his kid won't talk to him after we got raided. And Sarah... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Sarah? My wife, ex-wife. She tried to get me to quit, said the club was poison. I chose them over her. Jake's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She was right, about everything. They walked in silence past the remains of what might have been stables, where wild vines had reclaimed the stone walls. In the distance, Jake could see other ruins scattered across the landscape, a village that had once thrived in the shadow of the castle. The darkness is spreading, Ezra said, following his gaze. Each day, more of what remains falls to shadow. The curse that holds me prisoner is connected to something larger, something that threatens not just this realm, but all the worlds that touch it. Jake pulled out his phone instinctively, forgetting again that it showed no signal, no connection to the world he'd left behind. How do you know I won't just screw this up too? Maybe your magic made a mistake. Magic doesn't make mistakes. It simply sees truth more clearly than we do. Ezra's mental voice grew gentle. You speak of failure, yet you led men who had given up on themselves. You planned strategies that kept them alive in a dangerous world, and when your wife asked you to choose, it caused you such pain that you're still carrying it years later. Pain doesn't make me a hero. No, but caring does. And despite what you tell yourself, you care deeply about those you consider your responsibility. Ezra stopped at what had once been a fountain, now dry and choked with weeds. The curse can only be broken by one who has lost everything yet still possesses the will to fight for others. Tell me, Jake, if you could save your friends, your wife, everyone you have ever cared about, would you try even knowing you might fail? Jake stared at the broken fountain, seeing his own reflection fractured in a puddle of stagnant water. He thought of Tommy behind bars, of Mick drowning his sorrows, of Sarah building a new life without him. He thought of all the ways he'd failed them, all the chances he'd missed to be better than what the world expected from someone like him. Yeah, he said finally. I'd try. The donkey nodded, and for just a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw the shadow of a man overlaying the animal's form. Then, perhaps we should begin. The motorcycle's engine growled to life beneath Jake, but something felt different. The familiar vibration that usually centered him now seemed foreign, mechanical, dead compared to the living magic he'd just experienced. His leather jacket hung loose on his shoulders as he guided the bike down the winding mountain road, the enchanted donkey's words echoing in his mind like a mantra he couldn't shake. The useless shall inherit the earth. What did that even mean? Jake had spent his entire life being told he was worthless, by his father, by teachers, by every authority figure who'd written him off as just another troublemaker from the wrong side of town. He'd embraced that label, worn it like armor. But now, sitting astride 800 pounds of chrome and steel, he felt more uncertain than he had in years. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, heat waves shimmering off the asphalt like ghostly dancers. Jake pulled into a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the afternoon sun. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few semis and a patrol car that made Jake's stomach tighten instinctively. Inside, the air conditioning battled against the desert heat, while a waitress with tired eyes poured coffee for a trucker reading yesterday's newspaper. Jake slid into a corner booth, his boots scraping against the worn linoleum. The normal world felt like a costume that no longer fit properly. You look like you've seen a ghost, honey. The waitress appeared at his table, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read Dolores, and her smile carried the weight of someone who'd served coffee to countless lost souls traveling these empty roads. Something like that, Jake muttered, accepting the cup she poured without asking. I've been working this stretch for 23 years, Dolores said, settling into the seat across from him with the familiarity of someone who read people like weather patterns. You learn to spot the ones who've stumbled onto something bigger than themselves. They all get that same look, like they're seeing the world through different eyes. Jake studied her face, searching for any sign that she might understand what he'd experienced. You ever hear stories about magical things? Out in the desert, I mean. Dolores laughed, but it wasn't mocking. Honey, this desert's older than civilization. The native tribes around here have legends going back thousands of years. My grandmother used to tell stories about hidden places where the old magic still lives, waiting for the right person to find it. The right person, Jake repeated slowly. Or maybe the wrong person, she continued, refilling his cup. Sometimes it's the broken ones, the outcasts who can see what others miss, the ones who've got nothing left to lose. Through the diner's window, Jake watched the patrol car's occupant, a sheriff's deputy with mirrored sunglasses, scanning the parking lot with professional interest. The sight triggered old instincts, years of running from authority, but Jake forced himself to remain seated. He was different now, wasn't he? Or was he still just Jake Morrison, small-town screw-up with delusions of grandeur? You know what I think? Dolores said, following his gaze. I think magic doesn't care about your past. It cares about what you're willing to become. The deputy entered the diner, his radio crackling with static and voices. He nodded to Dolores and took a seat at the counter, but Jake could feel the man's attention like weight on his shoulders. Old habits died hard. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, checking for anything that might cause trouble. Jake Morrison? The deputy's voice cut through the diner's ambient noise like a blade. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Yes, sir? Your bike's registered properly. Plates are clean. The deputy's tone was neutral, professional. Just wanted to let you know there's been some unusual activity reported in the mountains lately. Folks seeing strange lights, hearing things. You notice anything odd up there? Jake met the man's eyes in the reflection of his sunglasses. Nothing I could explain, officer. Fair enough. Just be careful. Desert can play tricks on a man's mind, especially when he's riding alone. After the deputy left, Dolores squeezed Jake's shoulder. That wasn't about your bike registration, was it? No, Jake admitted. I think word's getting out about whatever's happening up there. Then you'd better figure out what you're going to do about it, honey. Because if the old stories are true, if something magical has really awakened, it won't stay hidden for long. And when the world comes looking for answers, they'll find you whether you're ready or not. Jake left money on the table and walked back to his motorcycle. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in those mountains, an enchanted donkey waited with secrets that could change everything. He had a choice to make, run like he always had, or embrace whatever destiny had found him in that crumbling tower. The engine roared to life, and Jake turned back toward the mountains. The donkey's words hung in the air like smoke from Jake's exhaust pipe. The convergence draws near. Jake had heard those exact words before, whispered in his nightmares ever since the accident that killed his brother Tommy. He'd always assumed they were just his guilt talking, but now, "You know something about my dreams," Jake said, his voice rough with suspicion. It wasn't a question. Gideon's ears drooped slightly. The barriers between worlds have been thinning for years. Those who carry deep wounds often hear the echo of what's coming. Your brother's death, it wasn't random, was it? The question hit Jake like a sledgehammer to the chest. He'd never told anyone about the strange circumstances surrounding the crash, the way the road had seemed to shimmer and twist, the impossible shadows that moved against the light, the feeling that something had been hunting them through the darkness. That thing on the highway, Jake whispered, the shadow with teeth. You're telling me it was real? A void stalker. They slip through the cracks when the barriers weaken. Gideon's ancient eyes held centuries of sorrow. I'm sorry, Jake. If I had found you sooner. Rage flared in Jake's chest, familiar and comfortable. So my brother died because you couldn't do your damn job? No. Gideon's voice carried the weight of mountains. Your brother died because he was protecting you. The stalker was hunting you specifically. Tommy threw himself between you and certain death. The world tilted sideways. Jake stumbled backward until he hit the stone wall, gasping for air that felt thick as water. All this time, he'd blamed himself for Tommy's death. But if the creature had been after him, why? The word came out broken. Why was it hunting me? Gideon approached slowly, his hooves echoing in the chamber. Because you're not entirely human, Jake. Your mother never told you about her grandmother, did she? The one who disappeared into the mountains? Jake's mind raced. His mother had mentioned great-grandmother Vera only once, calling her touched and refusing to elaborate. Family legend claimed she'd walked into the Rockies one winter night and never returned. She was a bridge walker, Gideon continued. Someone born with the ability to move between worlds. It's a rare gift that skips generations, but it marks the bloodline forever. The void hungers for such power. This is insane. Jake ran, shaking hands through his hair. I fix motorcycles. I drink beer. I'm not some magical... When did you first know exactly what was wrong with an engine before you even looked at it? Gideon interrupted gently. When did you start sensing the soul of machines? When did broken things begin calling to you? The questions struck home with surgical precision. Jake had always been freakishly good with repairs, able to diagnose problems that stumped veteran mechanics. He'd assumed it was intuition, but the ability had grown stronger over the years. Lately, he could almost hear damaged engines pleading for help. The gift manifests differently in each generation, Gideon explained. Your great-grandmother could open doorways. You can sense the essence of things, their true nature beneath surface damage. It's why you found me. The tower called to you because I needed saving. Jake laughed bitterly. Right. The useless biker saves the magical donkey. This gets better and better. You still don't understand. Gideon's eyes blazed with sudden intensity. The convergence isn't just two worlds touching, it's a deliberate invasion. The void has been preparing for decades, sending scouts, weakening our defenses. They need bridge walkers to anchor their assault on this reality. So, they'll come after me again. They're already here. That sensation you felt on the highway tonight, the wrongness in the air, void stalkers have crossed over in force. They're hunting you, your sister Sarah, anyone you care about. The convergence begins when they drag you back to their realm. Sarah. Jake's blood turned to ice. His little sister was probably at home right now, studying for her nursing exams, completely unaware that nightmare creatures were stalking her because of him. I have to warn her, he said, pushing off from the wall. Warning isn't enough. The stalkers can track your bloodline across vast distances. Running will only delay the inevitable. Gideon stepped into Jake's path. But there is another way. I'm listening. We fight back. The convergence requires specific conditions, a massive release of life force at the intersection of ley lines. If we can disrupt their ritual, we stop the invasion. Exactly, but it won't be easy. The void has corrupted humans to serve as anchors in this world. They've been gathering power for years, hiding among your kind. Gideon's expression grew grim. Some of them you might even know. Jake thought about the strange phone call that had sent him to the tower. The voice had claimed to be a client, but something about it had felt wrong. Too smooth, too knowing. How do we find them? Gideon smiled, and for the first time it looked genuinely hopeful. With your gift and my knowledge, we hunt the hunters. But first, we need allies. Other broken souls like us. The forgotten, the discarded, the supposedly useless. You think they'll help? When the world ends, Jake, outcasts have the most to lose. And sometimes, Gideon's eyes twinkled with ancient mischief, the most to gain. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones like ghostly fingers as Jake followed Seraphina deeper into the whispering veil. His leather jacket, once a symbol of rebellion on asphalt highways, now felt like armor against the ethereal chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Behind them, Barnaby's hooves clicked against the cobblestones with an oddly musical rhythm, each step echoing off the towering ruins that flanked their path. "The Council of Echoes won't be easily convinced," Serafina warned, her silver hair catching the pale sunlight filtering through the canopy above. "They've grown suspicious of outsiders since the shadow blight began spreading." Jake adjusted his grip on the satchel containing the heartstone fragments they'd gathered. The crystals hummed with a warmth that contradicted their fractured appearance, much like everything else in this impossible realm. "Story of my life. Never been good at first impressions anyway." Barnaby snorted, a sound that might have been laughter. "Perhaps because you lead with scowls and crossed arms, dear Jake. The council responds better to humility than bravado." "I don't do humble," Jake muttered, then caught himself. 3 weeks ago, he wouldn't have done talking donkeys either, yet here he was. The realization struck him with unexpected force, how much had already changed since that night in the tower. The anger that had been his constant companion for years felt different somehow, still present, but no longer the driving force behind every breath. They emerged into a circular clearing where 7 massive trees formed a natural amphitheater. Each trunk bore intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe when Jake wasn't looking directly at them. At the center stood a crystalline pool that reflected not the sky above, but swirling galaxies of stars and nebulae that definitely didn't belong to any universe he knew. "The Seat of Whispers," Serafina announced, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "Here, the boundary between what is and what could be grows thin." As if summoned by her words, 7 figures materialized from the shadows of the trees. They weren't quite human, too tall, too graceful, with eyes that held the depth of centuries. Their robes seemed woven from mist and moonlight, constantly shifting between solid and ethereal. The center figure stepped forward, and when it spoke, its voice harmonized with itself in impossible ways. "Serafina of the Silver Path, you return bearing strangers and dire purpose. The echoes speak of choices that will reshape the very foundation of our realm." Jake felt the weight of their collective gaze settle upon him like a physical thing. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to crack a joke, to armor himself in sarcasm and defiance. Instead, he found himself thinking of Maria's laugh, of Tommy's small hand in his, of all the people counting on him to be something more than the failure he'd always believed himself to be. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said simply, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I don't belong here, and I sure as hell don't understand most of what's happening. But people I care about are in danger, and apparently I'm the only one who can help them." Barnaby moved to stand beside him, the donkey's presence oddly comforting. "He carries the mark of the forgotten," Barnaby announced. "The ancient seal recognizes him as one who has been discarded, overlooked, deemed without worth. In our darkest hour, such perception becomes our greatest strength." One of the council members glided closer, studying Jake with eyes like liquid starlight. "Show us," it commanded. Jake hesitated, then slowly rolled up his sleeve. The mark on his forearm had grown since their last encounter with the shadow blight. What had been a simple spiral now resembled a complex mandala of interwoven symbols that pulsed with soft blue light. A collective intake of breath rippled through the council. The center figure raised one impossibly long hand, and the air above the crystalline pool shimmered. Images began to form in the reflective surface, scenes of devastation spreading across the magical realm, tendrils of darkness consuming entire forests, creatures of light being drained of their essence. The blight grows stronger, the figure intoned. It feeds on certainty, on the rigid belief that things must be as they have always been. Only through the power of the forgotten, those who exist in the spaces between what was expected and what became, can it be challenged. Jake stared at the images, seeing not just the destruction, but the fear in the faces of the realm's inhabitants. It reminded him uncomfortably of the expressions he'd seen in his own neighborhood, the resignation of people who'd been told they didn't matter for so long they'd started to believe it. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The council exchanged glances that conveyed volumes in the space between heartbeats. Finally, their leader spoke. "You must journey to the heart of echoes, where the first magic was born. There, you will face not the blight itself, but the source of its power, the collective belief that some souls are worth more than others. Serafina stepped forward, her expression grave. "Jake, you should know. No one who has attempted this trial has ever returned unchanged. Many haven't returned at all." The morning sun cast long shadows through the ancient grove as Jake checked his motorcycle one last time. The engine purred with an otherworldly hum now, threads of silver magic woven through the chrome and steel. Barnaby stood nearby, his coat shimmering with residual starlight from their transformation ritual. "You sure about this route?" Jake asked, studying the crystalline map that floated before them. The paths to the shadow courts twisted through territories marked with ominous symbols, skull trees, weeping stones, the maze of lost voices. "The direct path would take us through the Heart Guard's strongest fortifications," Barnaby replied, his voice carrying new authority. "This way, we avoid their patrols but face other challenges." Jake swung his leg over the bike, feeling the familiar weight of his leather jacket, now reinforced with protective runes Ilara had hastily stitched into the lining. "Other challenges I can handle. It's armies I'm trying to avoid." They set off through the grove, leaving behind the relative safety of the neutral territories. Within an hour, the landscape began to change. The vibrant greens faded to muted greys, and the very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Trees grew in impossible angles, their branches reaching downward like grasping fingers. "First landmark coming up," Barnaby warned. "The whispering stones. Whatever they tell you, don't listen too closely." Jake saw them ahead, a circle of towering black monoliths that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As they approached, voices began to drift from the stones, soft at first, then growing stronger. "Jake Morrison," the voices called, speaking in unison. "We know you, broken one, useless son, failed protector." His hands tightened on the handlebars, but Jake kept riding. The voices grew more insistent, dredging up every failure, every moment of weakness. They spoke of Sarah's disappointed face when he'd chosen the road over responsibility, of his father's final words calling him worthless. "The voices lie by telling twisted truths," Barnaby said quietly. "Remember what you've learned about being useless." Jake focused on the donkey's words, on the strange power he'd discovered in accepting rather than fighting his nature. The voices began to fade, their accusations losing their sting as he acknowledged them without letting them define him. They cleared the stones and pressed on, entering a region where the very ground seemed unstable. Reality shifted in subtle ways. Distances stretched and compressed. Colors bled into one another like watercolors in rain. Jake's motorcycle, enhanced by magic though it was, struggled with the inconsistent physics. "The maze of lost voices is just ahead," Barnaby announced as they crested a hill. "This is where it gets truly dangerous." The maze spread before them like a wound in the earth, towering walls of thorns and bone that twisted in impossible geometries. Even from the entrance, Jake could hear the sounds within, sobbing, laughter, screams, and conversations, in languages that hurt to comprehend. "The voices in there aren't echoes," Barnaby explained. "They're fragments of people who became lost, pieces of their souls that never found their way out. The maze feeds on certainty and confidence. The more sure you are of your direction, the more lost you become." Jake studied the entrance, understanding dawning. "But someone who's already lost—" "Exactly. Someone who's comfortable with being directionless might find their way through by not trying to find their way at all." They entered the maze cautiously. Immediately, the walls began to shift around them, passages opening and closing with wet organic sounds. The voices grew louder, fragments of conversations, half-remembered songs, desperate pleas for help. Jake felt his instincts kick in, the old need to forge ahead, to power through obstacles, but he forced himself to relax, to let go of any sense of destination. Instead of choosing directions, he let the motorcycle drift where it wanted to go, following Barnaby's patient lead. "Turn left here," suggested a voice from the walls, sweet and helpful. No, right is better, insisted another. Jake ignored them both, continuing straight through what looked like solid thorn wall, but parted like mist at their approach. The maze fought them, creating false exits that led deeper in, conjuring phantom images of their destination to lure them off course. But Jake had spent too many years wandering aimlessly on highways that led nowhere to be fooled by the promise of easy answers. "You're getting the hang of this," Barnaby observed, as they navigated a section where the walls were made of mirrors reflecting distorted versions of themselves. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, they emerged from the maze onto a plateau overlooking a vast dark valley. In the distance, barely visible through perpetual twilight, rose the spires of the shadow courts, twisted towers of black glass and midnight stone that seemed to bend space around them. "There," Barnaby said simply, "the heart of the enemy's power." Jake revved the engine, feeling its magical purr resonate with something deep in his chest. "Then let's go have a conversation they won't forget." The ancient stones beneath Jake's boots crumbled as he descended deeper into the Shadowlands, each step echoing like a funeral bell through the twisted realm. Meridian trotted beside him, her silver coat now dulled to pewter in the perpetual twilight that choked this forsaken place. The air tasted of copper and decay, and Jake could feel something fundamental about himself changing with every breath. "You're quieter than usual," Meridian observed, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor, "even for someone who grunts more than he speaks." Jake's hand instinctively moved to his chest, where the mark of the useless had begun to burn 3 days ago. The sensation wasn't painful exactly, more like a constant reminder that he was becoming something other than human. The silvery lines had spread from his heart outward, now visible beneath his skin like veins of liquid moonlight. "Something's happening to me," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual, "ever since we crossed into this place." They paused at the edge of a vast chasm, where twisted bridges of bone and shadow stretched across the void. In the distance, the spire of sorrows jutted upward like a broken finger, its peak lost in roiling clouds that sparked with malevolent energy. Somewhere in that tower, the heart of emptiness waited, the source of the curse that had branded Jake and countless others as worthless. Meridian studied the bridges with calculating eyes. The transformation accelerates near the heart. "You're not just carrying the mark anymore, Jake. You're becoming it. What's that supposed to mean?" "The mark of the useless isn't a curse," she said, stepping carefully onto the nearest bridge. The ancient bones groaned but held. "It's a key, and keys must be shaped to fit their locks." Jake followed, trying not to look down into the abyss where things with too many eyes writhed in the darkness. "So I'm what? Turning into some kind of magical skeleton key?" "In a sense." Meridian's hooves clicked against bone as they made their way across. "Every person marked as useless by this world contains a fragment of pure potential, untapped, unrecognized. The mark gathers those fragments." A memory surfaced, his father's voice echoing through their garage 20 years ago. "You'll never amount to anything, boy, just another waste of space." Jake had believed those words for so long they'd become part of him, carved deeper than any tattoo. The bridge swayed as wind howled up from the chasm, carrying with it the whispered doubts of 1,000 broken souls. Jake pressed forward, his silver-veined hands gripping the bone railings as the voices tried to burrow into his mind. "Not worthless. Useless. Why do you even try?" "They're trying to break your concentration," Meridian called over the psychic storm. "Don't listen." But Jake was listening, not to the voices of despair, but to something else. Beneath the cacophony of self-doubt, he could hear another sound, faint at first, then growing stronger. It was the sound of engines, dozens of them. "The Brotherhood. They followed us," he breathed. Meridian's ears swiveled. Impossible. The barriers between realms would mean nothing to Tank if he was desperate enough. Jake's jaw tightened. "And I left him behind. Again." They reached the far side of the bridge as the sound of motorcycles grew louder. Through the perpetual mist, Jake could see lights approaching. Not the harsh glare of headlights, but the softer glow of the marked. The brotherhood had crossed over, and they were bringing their own accumulation of society's discarded with them. "This changes everything," Meridian said. "If they reach the heart while you're still transforming, they'll be torn apart." Jake's hands clenched into fists. Tank doesn't understand what he's walking into. Neither do you. Meridian's voice carried a weight of ancient knowledge. The heart of emptiness feeds on worthlessness, on the accumulated pain of being discarded, but it also fears something, the moment when the useless choose to be useful anyway. Jake looked at his hands, now more silver than flesh. The transformation was accelerating, and with it came an understanding that felt borrowed from somewhere else. The mark wasn't just changing his body, it was connecting him to every person who'd ever been told they didn't matter. "How long do I have before the transformation completes?" "Hours, maybe less." "And then?" Meridian met his eyes, her ancient gaze holding depths of sorrow and hope in equal measure. "Then you become the weapon this realm needs, or the monster it deserves. The choice, surprisingly, is still yours." The sound of engines grew closer, and Jake could feel the pull of the spire ahead. His brothers were coming, ready to follow him into hell itself. The heart of emptiness pulsed in the distance like a malignant star, and somewhere between his humanity and whatever he was becoming lay the power to save them all. Time to find out if useless could become indispensable. Time to ride into the dark and bring back the light. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones like forgotten memories as Jake led Barnaby through the narrow pass between two towering cliffs. 3 days had passed since they'd escaped the Shadow Court's assassins, and the donkey's newly awakened magic still crackled unpredictably around them. Yesterday, Barnaby had accidentally turned an entire grove of oak trees into crystalline sculptures while trying to purify a tainted stream. The day before that, his emotional outburst had created a localized aurora that painted the sky in impossible colors for hours. "Easy there, partner," Jake murmured as Barnaby's ears began to glow with that telltale silver light. The donkey was picking up on something, his enhanced senses detecting threats that Jake's human perception couldn't grasp. "What's got you spooked?" Barnaby's response came not in words but in images that flooded Jake's mind, a gift of their deepening bond. Jake saw flashes of massive stone guardians, their eyes blazing with malevolent fire, and behind them a fortress carved directly into the mountainside. The Ironhold Citadel, where the consortium kept their most dangerous prisoners and conducted their darkest experiments. "Sammy," Jake breathed, his sister's name a prayer on his lips. According to the rebel contacts they'd met 2 nights ago, she was being held somewhere within those walls, along with dozens of other humans who'd been deemed magically significant by the consortium's twisted research division. They crested a ridge, and the citadel came into view. Jake's heart sank. The fortress was a monument to impossible architecture, its black towers spiraling upward in defiance of natural law. Protective barriers shimmered around its perimeter like heat mirages, and Jake could see the enormous stone sentries marching in precise patterns along the walls. "How the hell are we supposed to get in there?" Jake asked, but Barnaby was already moving, picking his way down a treacherous path that seemed to appear beneath his hooves. The donkey's magic was learning, adapting, becoming more intuitive with each passing hour. They'd barely made it halfway down the slope when the attack came. The air split open like torn fabric, and 3 figures in midnight blue robes materialized from the void. Consortium battle mages, their faces hidden behind masks of polished obsidian. Jake recognized the leader immediately. Archon Vex, the same bastard who'd orchestrated the raid on the Crossroads sanctuary where they'd first learned of Sammy's capture. The wayward child and his broken beast, Vex's voice echoed with unnatural resonance. "You've caused the consortium considerable inconvenience." Jake's hand moved instinctively to the enchanted blade at his hip, a weapon gifted by the forest spirits they'd aided 3 days prior. But before he could draw steel, Barnaby stepped forward, and the very air around them began to sing. The donkey's transformation was breathtaking and terrible. Silver light erupted from his coat, but this wasn't the wild, uncontrolled magic of before. This was focused, purposeful, shaped by an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly compassionate. The light didn't just illuminate, it revealed. Jake watched in amazement as the magic stripped away the battle mage's illusions, showing their true forms beneath the intimidating robes. They were children, 3 kids who couldn't have been older than 16, their eyes glazed with the telltale signs of mind control enchantments. "Ah, hell," Jake muttered, his righteous anger deflating into something more complex. He'd been prepared to fight monsters, not victims. But Barnaby was already moving. The donkey's magic reached out like gentle hands, touching the minds of the ensorcelled teens with infinite care. Jake felt echoes of that touch through their bond, the sensation of cobwebs being swept away, of sunlight piercing through suffocating darkness. The first boy collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face as awareness returned to his eyes. "Where am I?" he whispered. "The last thing I remember was going to bed in my dorm room, at the academy." The other 2 were coming around as well, the consortium's control spells unraveling like poorly knitted scarves. But their freedom came at a cost. Barnaby swayed on his feet, his silver glow flickering dangerously. Breaking 3 high-level enchantments simultaneously had drained him badly. "We need to move," Jake said, helping the confused teenagers to their feet. "Those control spells breaking will send up alarms throughout the citadel. They'll know we're here." As if summoned by his words, a bone-deep horn note echoed across the mountainside. The fortress's defensive systems were activating, and Jake could see more figures materializing along the battlements. The youngest of the freed mages, a girl with prematurely white hair, grabbed Jake's arm. "You're going into the citadel, aren't you? To rescue someone?" Jake nodded grimly. "Then you'll need this." She pressed a small crystal pendant into his palm. "It's a prison key. They made us help forge dozens of them before they took our minds. It'll open any cell in the lower dungeons." Hope flared in Jake's chest as Barnaby rallied his remaining strength. Together, they turned toward the impossible fortress and the sister waiting somewhere within its walls. The ground beneath Jake's boots trembled as reality itself seemed to fracture around them. Through the swirling chaos of the dimensional rift, he could see fragments of his old life. The garage where he'd spent countless hours rebuilding engines, the dive bar where his crew gathered every Friday night, the cemetery where he'd buried too many brothers. Each image flickered like a dying television screen before dissolving into the maelstrom. "We're losing the connection," Ember's voice cut through the supernatural wind that whipped around them. The enchanted donkey's usually bright eyes were dim with exhaustion, her magical reserves nearly depleted from holding open the passage between worlds. Jake's leather jacket snapped in the ethereal gale as he turned back toward the crystalline spires of the magical realm. The Shadow March had consumed nearly half the kingdom in the hours since they'd begun the ritual. Dark tendrils crept across the landscape like spilled ink, swallowing everything in their path. Ancient forests, gleaming cities, entire populations fleeing in terror. "I can't leave them," he said, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "Not when I finally understand." Princess Lirali materialized beside them, her gossamer robes torn and stained with the silver blood of fallen magical creatures. Her usually perfect features were haggard, streaked with tears and ash. "Jake, you must go." The prophecy was clear. Only someone deemed useless by both worlds can serve as the bridge. But if you die here, both realms fall into eternal darkness. The irony wasn't lost on him. A lifetime of being called worthless, of being dismissed as just another broken-down biker with nothing to offer, had prepared him for this moment. In a world of knights and sorcerers, princesses and dragons, his very ordinariness had become extraordinary. Ember staggered, her legs buckling as another wave of exhaustion hit her. "Jake, I can't hold it much longer. The portal is collapsing." Through their mystical bond, Jake felt her pain as if it were his own. The stubborn little donkey who'd refused to give up on him was literally burning herself out to keep his escape route open. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her trembling flank. "You've done enough, girl. More than enough." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew he couldn't abandon this world, not after witnessing the pure evil of the Shadow March, not after seeing what it did to innocent creatures caught in its path. In his old life, he'd been powerless to save his brothers from bullets and overdoses and their own demons. Here, he had the chance to save everyone. "There's another way," he said quietly, standing and facing the approaching wall of darkness. "The ritual doesn't require me to survive it, just to complete it." "No." Princess Lirale grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the worn leather. "There has to be another solution. We can regroup, find reinforcements." "With what?" Jake gestured toward the devastation spreading across the horizon. "Your armies are scattered. The mage councils are in hiding. Every minute we wait, more people die." He looked down at Ember, seeing his own determination reflected in her large brown eyes. "You know I'm right, don't you, girl?" The Shadow March crept closer, its whispers growing louder, promises of power, threats of annihilation, the voices of everyone he'd ever failed crying out in accusation. But for the first time in his life, Jake wasn't running from those voices. He was running toward something greater. "Tell them," he said to Princess Lirale, pulling free from her grip. "Tell them that sometimes the most broken souls hold the greatest power because we understand what it means to lose everything. We know the real value of what we're fighting for." The princess's composure cracked entirely then, tears streaming down her face. "You're not broken, Jake. You never were. You were just waiting for this moment, this purpose." Jake smiled, feeling lighter than he had in decades. The weight of all his failures, all his regrets, seemed to lift from his shoulders. He'd spent so long believing he was useless that he'd never considered he might be exactly what the universe needed. "Take care of Ember for me," he said, then paused. "Actually, she'll probably end up taking care of you." The donkey brayed once, a sound filled with love and loss and fierce pride. Jake felt her magic surge one final time, strengthening his resolve, gifting him with everything she had left to give. He turned toward the Shadow March, toward certain death and possible salvation, and began to walk. Behind him, the portal collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, sealing his fate. There was no going back now. The darkness reached for him with hungry tendrils, and Jake walked willingly into its embrace, carrying the light of two worlds in his scarred and beautiful heart. The crystalline walls of the Shadowlands prison shimmered with malevolent energy as Jake pressed his palms against the cold surface. Through the translucent barrier, he could see Mercy pacing in the adjacent cell, her silver coat dulled by the oppressive magic that bound this place. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not defeat, but a fierce determination that mirrored his own. "The others?" Jake's voice came out as a harsh whisper. "Alive," Mercy replied, her telepathic voice strained. "Scattered across different cells. The Void King wants us to witness something." Before Jake could respond, the air around them began to ripple. The prison walls became transparent, revealing a vast circular chamber beyond. At its center stood the Void King, his form more solid now than Jake had ever seen him. Dark energy swirled around the entity like living smoke, and in his skeletal hands he held a sphere of writhing shadows. Behold, the Void King's voice echoed through every cell simultaneously, the culmination of centuries of planning. The sphere began to expand, and within its depths, Jake could see images flickering past like scenes from a nightmare. His childhood home, the garage where he'd first learned to work on engines, the faces of the few people who'd ever shown him kindness, all of them being consumed by creeping darkness. "Your world bleeds into mine through every act of cruelty, every moment of despair," the Void King continued. "But it has never been enough. I required a catalyst, someone whose pain ran so deep it could serve as a permanent bridge between realms. Jake's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "You've been watching me since you were a child, Jake Morrison. Every abandonment, every failure, every time you were cast aside as worthless, it all fed the connection. And when you found hope in this magical realm, when you began to believe you might be something more, the Void King's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. You made yourself the perfect conduit." The sphere pulsed, and Jake felt something inside his chest respond, a cold, hollow sensation he'd carried his entire life. The pain of never being enough, of being discarded by everyone who should have loved him. He watched in horror as tendrils of shadow began seeping from his skin. "The bridge is nearly complete," the Void King said. "Soon, both worlds will know the same emptiness that has defined your existence." But then Mercy's voice cut through the despair, sharp and clear. "You're wrong about him." The Void King turned toward her cell, his attention momentarily diverted. "The beast speaks. You see only his pain because that's all you understand," Mercy continued, her voice growing stronger. "But pain isn't what makes Jake who he is. It's what he does with it that matters." Jake felt the shadow tendrils pause, as if responding to her words. Around the chamber, he could see his companions in their various cells, Elena clutching her crystal pendant, Finn gripping the bars with white knuckles, even the usually composed Thorn watching with fierce intensity. "You want to know what makes someone truly useless?" Jake said, finding his voice. The Void King's hollow gaze fixed on him. "It's giving up. It's letting the pain define you instead of choosing to fight through it." The shadows around him wavered, and Jake pressed on. "I've been broken more times than I can count. Thrown away, forgotten, treated like I didn't matter. But every single time, I got back up. Not because I'm strong, but because staying down would mean you win." He thought of the first time he'd met Mercy, how her belief in him had begun to heal wounds he'd carried for decades. He thought of Elena's unwavering loyalty, of Finn's infectious optimism, of how this ragtag group had become more of a family than he'd ever known. "The thing about being labeled useless," Jake continued, feeling warmth begin to push back against the cold in his chest, "is that it frees you from everyone else's expectations. You get to decide what you're worth." The shadow tendrils began retreating back into his skin, but now they carried something different, not just pain, but the strength he'd built from surviving it. The Void King stepped back, his form flickering with uncertainty. Impossible. The bridge was nearly complete. "Maybe," Jake said, pressing both hands against the prison wall. Where his palms touched, cracks began to spread through the crystalline surface. "But you forgot something important about broken things." The cracks widened, light seeping through from some source the Void King couldn't touch. Sometimes they're stronger at the broken places. The wall shattered outward in an explosion of crystal and light. Jake stepped through, feeling the warm presence of his companion's magic responding to his own newfound strength. The Void King raised his hands, dark energy crackling between his fingers, but Jake was already moving. He wasn't the same broken man who'd stumbled into a crumbling tower what felt like a lifetime ago. He was something new, something the Void King had never encountered. Someone who'd transformed their pain into purpose. The real battle was about to begin. The ancient stones beneath Jake's boots trembled as the Shadow Lord's laughter echoed through the crystalline chamber. Dark tendrils writhed around the massive obsidian throne, and Jake could feel the malevolent energy pressing against his chest like a physical weight. Patches stood beside him, the donkey's usual goofy demeanor replaced by an otherworldly calm that made Jake's skin prickle. "You think bringing that broken creature here will change anything?" The Shadow Lord's voice reverberated from everywhere and nowhere. "I have consumed entire kingdoms, absorbed the essence of thousands. What can one worthless biker and his pathetic companion possibly do?" Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the enchanted blade at his side, but Patches nudged him gently. The donkey's eyes glowed with an ancient wisdom that seemed impossible for such a simple creature. In that moment, Jake remembered what the oracle had told him back in the Whispering Woods. Sometimes the most powerful magic came from embracing what the world considered worthless. "You're right," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "I am just a biker. Been called useless my whole life, been told I'd never amount to anything." He took a step forward, feeling the dark energy push back against him. "But you know what I learned? The world's pretty bad at recognizing what really matters." The Shadow Lord's form shifted, becoming more solid, more real. Jake could see burning red eyes within the writhing darkness. Touching words, but words won't save your precious human world. "I have already begun the convergence. Soon, all realms will bow before me." Through the crystal walls, Jake could see the sky outside darkening unnaturally. Storm clouds gathered with impossible speed, and he caught glimpses of creatures, nightmarish beings he'd only seen in his worst dreams, materializing in the distance. The Shadow Lord wasn't bluffing. The invasion had begun. Patches stepped forward, and something extraordinary happened. The donkey's shabby brown coat began to shimmer, revealing glimpses of something magnificent beneath. Ancient symbols appeared along his flanks, glowing with soft silver light. The transformation was subtle but profound. Patches was still unmistakably a donkey, still humble and unassuming, but now Jake could sense the incredible power that had been hidden all along. "Impossible!" the Shadow Lord hissed. "The Guardian bloodline was destroyed centuries ago." "You thought you killed them all," Patches spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. "But you overlooked the smallest, the humblest, the one who seemed too insignificant to matter." Jake felt a surge of understanding. All this time, he'd thought he was helping Patches navigate this magical world. In reality, Patches had been guiding him, preparing him for this moment. The jobs they'd taken, the people they'd helped, the bonds they'd formed, it had all been leading here. The Shadow Lord erupted from his throne, no longer content to remain seated. His form towered above them, darkness spreading like oil across the crystal walls. "Guardian or not, you are still just two against the might of the void itself." "Three," came a voice from behind them. Jake spun to see Luna emerging from the shadows, her ranger's cloak torn but her bow ready. Behind her came Grimjaw the dwarf, his massive hammer crackling with lightning, then Whisperwind the elf, her staff glowing with protective wards. One by one their companions filled the chamber, everyone they'd helped, everyone who'd believed in them when the world had written them off. "How did you—" Jake started. "Did you really think we'd let you face this alone?" Luna notched an arrow that blazed with purified light. "You taught us something important, Jake. We're stronger together, especially when the world thinks we're weak." The Shadow Lord's rage was palpable now, distorting the air around them. A handful of misfits and outcasts. This changes nothing. But Jake could see it did change things. The symbols on Patches were growing brighter, and he could feel something awakening within himself. Not magic in the traditional sense, but something deeper. The connection he'd built with these people, the loyalty forged through shared struggles, the love he'd discovered for this strange family he'd found. It was a power the Shadow Lord couldn't understand because he'd spent eternity consuming and destroying rather than building and protecting. Jake drew his blade, feeling its weight settle perfectly in his hand. Around him, his friends readied their weapons and spells. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time since arriving in this magical realm, Jake felt truly ready. He wasn't just a broken-down biker anymore. He wasn't useless. He was exactly who he needed to be. The Shadow Lord gathered his power, and Jake smiled grimly. They were about to show this ancient evil what a bunch of society's rejects could really accomplish when they had something worth fighting for. The Shadowlands stretched endlessly before them, a twisted mirror of the world they'd left behind. Where green hills should have rolled, jagged obsidian peaks clawed at a crimson sky. The very air tasted of copper and decay, making Jake's throat burn with each breath. Meredith trotted beside him, her silver coat now gleaming like starlight against the darkness. The transformation that had revealed her true nature as an ancient guardian spirit had left Jake reeling, but there was no time to process the magnitude of what she truly was. The void's influence grew stronger with every step deeper into its domain. "The corruption runs deeper than I feared." Meredith's voice carried notes of sorrow that seemed to echo across centuries. This place was once the garden of first dreams, where new worlds were born from pure imagination. Jake pulled his leather jacket tighter, though it offered little protection against the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with temperature. How do we fix something like this? Before Meredith could answer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. From the twisted spires ahead came a sound that made Jake's soul recoil, the grinding shriek of reality being unmade. Dark figures emerged from crevices in the rock, their forms shifting between shadow and substance. "Void wraiths," Meredith breathed, "the consumed souls of those who tried to fight the emptiness and lost themselves to it." The wraiths moved with terrible purpose, their eyeless faces turned toward Jake and Meredith. As they approached, Jake could see fragments of who they once were: a knight's tarnished armor, a scholar's torn robes, a child's wooden toy clutched in skeletal fingers. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the switchblade in his pocket, then stopped. Steel wouldn't help him here. Instead, he thought of Sarah's laugh, of Tony's grease-stained smile, of the family he'd found in the garage that had given his aimless life meaning. The warmth of those memories pushed back against the encroaching cold. "They're not evil," he realized suddenly. "They're lost." Meredith's ears pricked forward. "What do you mean?" "Look at them. Really look." Jake stepped forward, ignoring Meredith's sharp intake of breath. "They're not attacking, they're reaching out." The nearest wraith extended a hand that flickered between bone and shadow. Jake saw it clearly now, not malice in the gesture, but desperate hope. These souls had been convinced they were useless, worthless failures. The void had fed on that despair until nothing remained but the hunger for validation they'd never found in life. "I know what you feel," Jake said quietly, his words carrying further than they should have in the thin air. "I've been there. Worthless, broken, a screw-up who ruins everything he touches." More wraiths emerged from the shadows, drawn by his voice. Meredith tensed, ready to defend him, but Jake held up a hand. "But being broken doesn't mean being useless," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in. Sometimes the people everyone's given up on are the ones who understand what really matters." The first wraith had stopped moving, its hollow gaze fixed on Jake's face. Slowly, impossibly, color began to seep back into its form. The tarnished armor brightened, revealing the emblem of a healer's order. "You were a night physician," Jake said softly. "You saved lives. You mattered." The wraith's form solidified completely, a young woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. She smiled once, tears streaming down her face, then dissolved into golden light that rose toward the crimson sky. Where the light touched the twisted landscape, small flowers began to bloom. One by one, Jake spoke to the gathered wraiths. He saw past their consumed shells to the people they'd been. A teacher who thought she'd failed her students, a father who believed he'd disappointed his children, a craftsman whose work was scorned by critics. To each, Jake offered the understanding he'd craved for so many years himself. As the last wraith transformed into ascending light, the landscape around them began to change. The obsidian peaks softened into rolling hills. The poisoned sky cleared to reveal stars Jake had never seen before. The Garden of First Dreams was remembering what it was meant to be. "How did you know?" Meredith asked, wonder coloring her ancient voice. Jake wiped his eyes, not caring that she saw the tears. "Because I was one of them. Just on the other side of the veil. The void doesn't create monsters. It feeds on people who've forgotten their own worth." He looked out over the transforming landscape. "But worth isn't something you earn. It's something you are." In the distance, a new light was growing. Not golden like the freed souls, but pure white, brilliant and warm. At its heart stood a tower that seemed to be built from crystallized hope itself. "The heart of all stories," Meredith whispered. "We've found it." But even as they began walking toward their destination, Jake could feel something vast and hungry stirring in the depths below. The void itself had awakened, and it was coming for them. The ancient cathedral's stones trembled as Jake stood before the obsidian throne, its surface reflecting the chaos erupting around them. The Shadow King's true form writhed between dimensions, neither fully corporeal nor completely spirit, his voice echoing from every corner of the crumbling sanctuary. "You think your little band of misfits can challenge eternity?" The Shadow King's laughter cracked the stained glass windows high above. "I have consumed worlds, boy. What are you but another broken soul pretending to matter?" Jake's hand tightened around the silver pendant that had once belonged to his daughter Sarah. The metal grew warm against his palm, pulsing with a light that seemed impossibly bright in this place of endless shadow. Behind him, Donovan snorted and pawed the ground, his usual comedy replaced by fierce determination. "Maybe I am broken," Jake said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Maybe we all are. But you know what I learned? Broken things can still cut." The Shadow King surged forward, his form shifting between man and void, reaching out with tendrils of pure darkness. They wrapped around Jake's arms and legs, burning cold against his skin. Pain shot through every nerve, but Jake held his ground. The pendant's light grew brighter. Sarah believed in useless things. Jake continued through gritted teeth. Stray cats, broken bicycles, me. The pendant blazed like a star. She taught me that useless doesn't mean worthless. Donovan brayed and charged forward, his hooves sparking against the cathedral stones. The little donkey's hide glowed with silver light as he barreled into the Shadow King's manifestation. The impact scattered darkness like smoke, giving Jake precious seconds to break free. Around the cathedral, the battle raged. Marcus swung his construction hammer in wide arcs, each strike blessed by some power Jake didn't understand but recognized as true. The old man moved with purpose, born from years of building things that lasted, creating rather than destroying. Every blow sent shadows scurrying back into cracks and crevices. Elena danced between reaching tendrils of void, her movements graceful despite the terror in her eyes. She clutched an old photograph, her son, Jake realized, and wherever she stepped, flowers bloomed from the ancient stones, life in a place that had known only death for centuries. But they were losing ground. The Shadow King was too vast, too old. His presence pressed down on them like the weight of every failure, every moment of despair Jake had ever known. "This is pointless," the Shadow King whispered directly into Jake's mind. "You couldn't save your daughter. You couldn't save your marriage. What makes you think you can save anything?" The words hit harder than any physical blow. Jake stumbled, the pendant's light flickering. Sarah's face swam before his eyes, pale in that hospital bed, looking up at him with trust he didn't deserve. "I couldn't," Jake admitted, and the Shadow King's triumphant laughter filled the air. "I failed her." But then Donovan was beside him, pressing his warm flank against Jake's leg. The donkey looked up with those impossibly knowing eyes, and Jake heard Sarah's voice in his memory. "Daddy, even donkeys can be heroes in fairy tales." "She didn't fail me," Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over mountains. "She saw something worth saving, something worth loving, even in someone like me." The pendant erupted with light that banished every shadow from the cathedral. But this wasn't Jake's power alone. He felt it flowing through the connections he'd made. Marcus's steady strength, Elena's nurturing hope, Donovan's simple faith that tomorrow could be better than today. All the broken pieces of their hearts fitted together into something stronger than any of them could be alone. The Shadow King recoiled, his form beginning to fray at the edges. "Impossible. You are nothing. You have always been nothing." "Yeah," Jake said, stepping forward as the light grew brighter still. "I'm useless. Can't hold down a job, Can't stay sober for more than a few months at a time. Can't save the people I love most." He raised the pendant high. "But you know what useless really means? It means I've got nothing left to lose. And that makes me dangerous." Shadow King's scream shattered what remained of the cathedral's windows as Jake's light touched him. But instead of destroying, Jake felt the strangest thing: pity. The Shadow King wasn't evil incarnate. He was just another broken soul, lost in his own pain for so long he'd forgotten what wholeness felt like. "I can't fix what's broken in you," Jake said softly, "but I can choose not to let it break me too." The light pulsed once more, gentle now rather than blazing, and in that gentleness, something in the Shadow King's ancient rage began to crack. The ancient battleground stretched before them like a wound in the earth itself. Jake stood at the edge of the sundering fields, his leather jacket torn and bloodied, the weight of 17 kingdoms pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, the remnants of their unlikely army gathered, broken creatures, cast-off beings, and the forgotten souls who had answered his call. At his side, Dusty's silver coat gleamed, despite the ash falling like snow from the crimson sky above. "You sure about this, partner?" Jake muttered, running his calloused hand along the donkey's neck. The gesture that had once seemed so foreign now felt as natural as breathing. Dusty's ancient eyes held depths Jake was still learning to read. The Void King believes strength lies in perfection, in dominion. He cannot comprehend that our greatest power comes from what he discards. Across the scarred plain, darkness gathered like a living thing. The Void King's forces moved with terrible precision, shadow knights on steeds of nightmare, creatures of pure malice that had never known doubt or weakness. At their head rode the Void King himself, his armor drinking in what little light remained in this desolate place. Jake felt the familiar ache of old wounds, the echo of every time he'd been called worthless, every door that had slammed in his face, every job he'd lost, every relationship that had crumbled. For so long, those failures had defined him. Now they felt different, not scars but seeds. "Listen up," he called to his ragtag army without turning around. His voice carried across the broken ground with an authority that surprised him. "I know what you're all thinking. Look at them, then look at us. They're everything the world says we should be, perfect, powerful, unified, and we're everything the world throws away." A murmur rippled through the ranks. 3-legged horses, magic users whose spells backfired more often than they worked, warriors too old or too young or too different to fit into proper armies. "But here's what I've learned," Jake continued, his hand finding the simple leather cord around his neck where a small crystal hung, a gift from the first village they'd saved, made by a child whose magic was considered too weak to matter. The world's got it backwards. They think being broken means being useless. They think being different means being wrong. The Void King's voice echoed across the battlefield, magnified by dark magic until it seemed to come from the earth itself. "Surrender the donkey and the pretender who rides with him. Your suffering will be brief." Jake swung himself onto Dusty's back, the motion fluid now after months of practice. Around them, his army stirred, not with the mechanical precision of the enemy, but with something far more dangerous, hope that had been tested and refused to die. "Here's what we know that they don't," Jake said, his voice somehow carrying to every ear despite speaking normally. "Every crack lets the light in. Every scar tells a story of survival. Every time we've been knocked down and gotten back up, we've learned something they can't teach in their perfect realm." Dusty stepped forward, his hooves striking sparks from the stone. "The magic was never in being whole," the donkey said, his words reaching both armies. "It was always in the healing, not in never falling, but in choosing to rise." The first charge came like a breaking wave of darkness. Jake felt time slow as it had in those first terrifying days when magic was new and overwhelming. But this time, he didn't fight the sensation. Instead, he leaned into it, letting his imperfect understanding of power guide him. His army moved like nothing the Void King had ever faced, chaotic, unpredictable, improvising solutions that shouldn't work, but somehow did. A one-eyed archer whose aim was terrible, but whose arrows sought their targets through sheer determination. A mage whose fire spells turned to flowers, except when they turned to something far more dangerous. A battalion of creatures too stubborn to know when they were beaten. Jake found himself in the heart of the melee, Dusty moving beneath him with grace that spoke of countless years and hard-won wisdom. The donkey's power flowed through him, not the overwhelming force he'd first experienced in the tower, but something gentler and infinitely more sustainable. The magic of mending, the strength that came from being broken and choosing to love anyway. The Void King carved toward them through the battle, his blade leaving trails of absolute darkness. Where it passed, color drained from the world, hope withered, and even the stones seemed to forget their purpose. "You cannot win," the Void King said as he drew near, his voice like winter wind through empty halls. "You are nothing but refuse, the discarded dregs of failed worlds." Jake met his gaze and smiled, the same crooked grin that had gotten him into trouble in a dozen roadside bars, but tempered now with something that hadn't been there before. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "We're not the discarded dregs." He urged Dusty forward, magic crackling between them like lightning given form. "We're the compost that feeds new growth." The dawn light filtered through the shattered remnants of what had once been the Shadow King's fortress, casting long golden rays across the battlefield where Jake stood beside Jasper. The enchanted donkey's silver coat gleamed, despite the dust and debris, his ancient eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to encompass all the pain and triumph of their journey. "Is it really over?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from the final battle. His leather jacket was torn, his hands still trembling from channeling the raw power that had ultimately destroyed the darkness threatening both worlds. Jasper turned those knowing eyes toward him. "The Shadow King is gone, but the real victory was never about defeating him. It was about you discovering who you truly are." Around them, the magical realm began to shimmer and shift. The twisted spires of the dark fortress crumbled into sparkling dust that danced on the morning breeze. Where corruption had spread like a cancer across the land, green shoots pushed through blackened earth, and crystal streams began to flow again with pure singing water. Jake felt the familiar tug in his chest, the pull back to his own world. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like completion. "The portal between worlds will remain," Jasper said, reading his thoughts as he always could. "But it will be hidden, protected. Only those who truly need to find it will be able to cross over. And you?" Jake knelt beside his unlikely companion, the donkey who had become his truest friend. "Will I see you again?" Jasper's response came not in words, but in a warm nuzzle against Jake's shoulder. In that touch, Jake felt everything, gratitude, love, and the unshakable bond forged between two souls who had found purpose in each other's brokenness. The world around them began to fade, reality blurring at the edges like watercolors in rain. Jake closed his eyes and felt himself falling, tumbling through space and time until his boots hit familiar asphalt. He stood in the parking lot outside Murphy's bar, his Harley gleaming in the afternoon sun exactly where he'd left it. The crumbling tower was nowhere to be seen, just an empty lot overgrown with wildflowers that hadn't been there before. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Tommy. "Hey man, heard about your accident. You okay? Been trying to reach you for days." Days. Had it really been days? It felt like a lifetime, but also like no time at all. He walked into Murphy's to find his old crew gathered around their usual table, concern written across their weathered faces. Danny looked up first, relief flooding his features. "Jesus, Jake, where the hell have you been? Your bike's been sitting out there for 3 days. We thought maybe you'd finally gone off the deep end." Jake slid into his usual chair, but everything felt different now. These men, who had once been his whole world, suddenly seemed smaller, their problems more manageable. The weight of being useless that had pressed down on him for so long had lifted, replaced by something he'd never expected to feel. Purpose. "I'm okay," he said simply. "Better than okay, actually." Over the next few hours, Jake listened to his friends complain about their jobs, their wives, their endless list of grievances against a world that hadn't given them what they thought they deserved. He recognized the anger and bitterness because it had been his own for so long. But now he also saw something else, their pain, their fear, their desperate need to matter. The same feelings that had driven him into that tower in search of something worth believing in. When Murphy called last call, Jake stood to leave. Outside in the parking lot, Tommy caught up with him. "You're different," his oldest friend observed. "Something happened to you." Jake straddled his Harley, feeling the familiar rumble of the engine beneath him. But even this had changed. The bike no longer felt like an escape route. It felt like a tool, a means of moving through the world with intention. As he rode through the empty streets toward home, Jake felt a warm presence beside him. He couldn't see Jasper, couldn't hear his voice, but he knew the donkey was there somehow, would always be there when needed. 3 blocks from his apartment, Jake spotted a kid sitting on a park bench, alone and shivering despite the warm night. Something in the boy's posture, the defeated slump of his shoulders, the way he stared at nothing, looked achingly familiar. Jake pulled over and cut the engine. The boy looked up, startled and defensive. "You okay, kid?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Jake thought of crumbling towers and enchanted donkeys, of power hidden in the most unlikely places. Sometimes the most broken souls hold the greatest power, and sometimes salvation comes riding up on a Harley in the middle of the night, offered by someone who understands what it means to be lost and found again.